On June 6, 1944, a young American sergeant named Joseph stood on the metal deck of a transport ship, his eyes fixed on the gray, misty horizon of the Normandy coast. Around him, the air was thick with the smell of diesel, salt spray, and a heavy, unspoken dread. As Joseph checked his M1 Garand rifle for the 10th time that morning, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, circular packet. To a casual observer, it looked absurd, completely out of place in the middle of the greatest invasion in human history. It was a standard-issue latex condom, but Joseph didn't use it for its intended purpose. Instead, he carefully stretched the thin rubber over the muzzle of his rifle, securing it tightly. Nearby, a veteran soldier caught his eye and gave a grim, knowing nod. They knew something that German observers on the cliffs did not. They knew that in the next 30 minutes, this 3-cent piece of rubber would be the only thing standing between them and a catastrophic weapon failure. Welcome to World War II survival, where today we look at one of the most bizarre yet genius battlefield hacks in history. Why the world's most elite soldiers went to war with condoms on their guns. The problem facing the Allied troops at Omaha and Utah Beach was not just the German MG-42 machine guns or the jagged steel obstacles waiting in the surf. It was something much smaller, much more persistent, and far more insidious: sand and salt water. In the chaotic moments of an amphibious landing, a soldier is rarely standing upright. You are crawling through the surf, diving into the wet sand, and dragging your equipment through a slurry of grit and salt. For a precision instrument like the M1 Garand or the Thompson submachine gun, this environment is a death sentence. The barrel of a rifle is a miracle of engineering, designed to contain the immense pressure of an exploding cartridge and to direct a lead projectile with pinpoint accuracy. But that engineering relies on a clear, unobstructed path. If even a small amount of wet sand or a plug of thick mud enters the muzzle, the physics of the weapon change instantly. When the trigger is pulled, the expanding gases have nowhere to go. The pressure builds up behind the obstruction in a fraction of a millisecond, and instead of a bullet flying forward, the steel barrel peels open like a banana skin, sending jagged shards of metal directly into the shooter's face. In the early years of the war, the military tried to issue specialized muzzle caps. They were often made of heavy rubber or metal, designed to snap onto the end of the barrel. However, they had a fatal flaw. In the heat of combat, when an enemy pops up from a foxhole 10 feet away, you do not have the 2 seconds required to reach up and pull off a cap. If you forget to remove it and pull the trigger, the heavy cap could cause the very barrel explosion it was meant to prevent. Soldiers needed something that was waterproof, sandproof, but most importantly, something they could shoot through in an instant. The solution came from an unlikely place. Supply officers began to realize that the latex condoms issued to soldiers for hygiene were the perfect material. They were incredibly thin, highly elastic, and completely waterproof. Best of all, they were so fragile that the air pressure preceding a bullet would simply vaporize the rubber before the projectile even touched it. A soldier could dive into the ocean, crawl through the mud of Normandy, and the moment he saw a target, he could fire his weapon without a single second of preparation. Imagine the scene from the perspective of a German defender in the Atlantic Wall. Through his binoculars, he sees thousands of Allied troops struggling through the waves. He sees men carrying rifles that look strange. There is a translucent, bulbous tip on the end of every barrel. To a German officer trained in rigid, traditional military discipline, this must have looked like a joke, a sign of a disorganized and desperate army. There are accounts in German journals of snipers mocking the ridiculous rubber balloons on the American guns. They laughed until the first wave of Rangers hit the dry sand. While the Germans expected the Americans to spend precious minutes cleaning their fouled weapons or clearing malfunctions caused by the grit, the Americans rose from the surf and immediately began laying down accurate, deadly fire. The joke was over. The latex covers had done their job perfectly, keeping the rifling dry and clean until the very microsecond the first round was chambered. The logistics of this survival hack were just as fascinating as the tactical application. During the preparation for Operation Overlord, the demand for condoms skyrocketed. Supply sergeants were ordering them by the hundreds of thousands, leading to some very awkward conversations with high-ranking officers who couldn't understand why a paratrooper division needed a massive surplus of contraceptives before jumping into a combat zone. But the paratroopers of the 101st and 82nd Airborne knew exactly why. As they prepared to jump into the dark, chaotic skies over France, they knew they might land in flooded marshes, farm ponds, or deep mud. A fouled barrel in the middle of a midnight drop behind enemy lines was a death warrant. By covering their barrels, they ensured that no matter where they landed, their primary tool of survival would be ready to speak. It wasn't just the rifles, they used them for the delicate muzzles of light machine guns and even the triggers of certain explosive devices. The effectiveness of this hack wasn't limited to the beaches of France. As the war moved to the Pacific theater, the environment became even more hostile. In the steaming jungles of Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, the enemy wasn't just the Japanese Imperial Army, it was the relentless, suffocating humidity and the torrential tropical rain. In the jungle, moisture is a constant predator. It seeps into every crevice, rusting internal springs and causing boar sweat that can ruin a rifle's accuracy in days. More dangerously, the thick, clay-like mud of the jungle floor was notorious for clogging barrels during banzai charges. Marines took the lessons from Normandy and applied them with even more frequency. They found that a covered muzzle not only kept out the mud, but also prevented the buildup of condensation inside the barrel, which could lead to pitting and corrosion. In a theater where a soldier might go days without a chance to properly clean his kit, this 3-cent insurance policy was the difference between a working rifle and a heavy club. Technical precision was the hallmark of the American war machine, but it was the battlefield ingenuity that truly set the GI apart. There is a deep psychological element to this survival tactic. It represents the pragmatic, no-nonsense attitude of the American soldier. While other armies might have waited for a formal engineering solution to come down from the high command, the American soldier looked at what he had in his pockets and solved the problem himself. This MacGyver spirit is what defined the survival culture of the U.S. military. They weren't just followers of manuals, they were problem solvers. They realized that the thinness of the latex allowed the gases to escape safely, and the projectile would pass through without any deviation in flight path. Ballistic tests later confirmed what the soldiers already knew. Shooting through a latex cover had zero impact on the bullet's trajectory at combat ranges. It was the perfect invisible shield. As the war progressed, the use of these rubber covers became so widespread that it was no longer a secret. However, it remained a point of cultural shock. British and Soviet troops often looked at the American practice with a mix of amusement and confusion. The Soviets, who fought in the freezing mud of the Eastern Front, often used simple wooden plugs or scraps of greasy cloth to protect their barrels. But these had to be removed manually before firing. The American solution was simply faster. In a war where the winner was often determined by who could fire the first accurate shot, those 2 seconds saved by a latex cover were an eternity. It is estimated that thousands of American lives were saved on D-Day alone, simply because their rifles didn't explode or jam during the critical first 30 minutes on the beach. Today, if you look at modern special forces, such as the Navy SEALs or the Green Berets, you will see a high-tech evolution of this simple hack. Modern operators use specialized, heavy-duty muzzle caps or even simple electrical tape to achieve the same result. But the principle remains identical to what Sergeant Joseph did on that transport ship in 1944. It is about protecting the integrity of the weapon at all costs. It is about understanding that in survival, there is no such thing as a silly solution if it keeps you alive. The condom on the rifle barrel remains one of the most enduring symbols of the common soldier's brilliance. It shows that even in the face of the most advanced technology of the era, the V-2 rockets, the Tiger tanks, the jet fighters, survival often came down to a simple, flexible piece of rubber and the common sense to use it. War is often remembered through the lens of grand strategy and massive movements of troops. We talk about the decisions of generals and the power of atomic bombs. But for the man in the foxhole, war is a series of very small, very personal technical problems. How do I stay warm? How do I keep my boots dry? And most importantly, how do I make sure my rifle fires when I need it most? The story of the muzzle cover is a tribute to that man. It's a reminder that history is made by those who are clever enough to adapt. Sergeant Joseph survived the beach at Normandy. He survived the hedgerows of France and the frozen woods of the Bulge. And in his kit, right next to his ammunition and his rations, he always kept a few extra packets of latex. Not for pleasure, but for the cold, hard reality of survival. At World War II survival, we believe these small details are what make history truly come alive. It's not just about who won the battle, it's about how they did it, one small hack at a time. The ingenuity of the greatest generation continues to inspire us because it proves that no matter how overwhelming the odds, there is always a way to adapt and overcome. If you found this deep dive into battlefield survival fascinating, make sure to look out for our next episode. We will be exploring an even more terrifying secret from the Pacific: the spider holes that turn the jungle floor into a lethal trap, and the psychological warfare that nearly broke the spirit of the U.S. Marines. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and remember, in the struggle for survival, the most powerful weapon you have is your mind.